There is a point in every long-running public saga where the story stops feeling like it is being watched and starts feeling like it is being judged. Not by institutions, not by editors, not even by critics, but by the audience itself. That shift is subtle at first. A change in tone, a slightly sharper joke, a pause where there used to be applause. For Harry and Meghan, that shift didn't arrive as a single headline or a single interview. It arrived as a pattern, repeated so often that even those who once defended the story began to notice the rhythm underneath it. And once you notice rhythm, you stop hearing the music. In the weeks following the Time 100 appearance, the narrative surrounding the Sussexes, already stretched thin by years of competing interpretations, entered a new phase. It was no longer just about what they said. It was about how every public appearance seemed to generate a second conversation, and then a third, and then a wave of commentary that often had nothing to do with the original event at all. Supporters called it obsession. Critics called it consequence. The public, increasingly fatigued, called it predictable. But what happened next wasn't predictable to the people living inside the story. It began with something small, almost insignificant in isolation, a charity announcement, a partnership update, a short promotional clip filmed in warm, carefully curated light. California tones, soft framing, the kind of visual language designed to signal calm, control, and modern relevance. On its own, it would have passed like background noise, but in the current climate, nothing existed on its own anymore. Within hours, the clip was being compared, dissected, reframed. Not just by traditional media, but by an ecosystem of commentary accounts, reaction channels, and long-form analysts who treated every gesture like a coded message. A smile became strategy. A pause became intention. A sentence became evidence. And somewhere in that transformation, the original message disappeared entirely. What replaced it was something else. Narrative gravity. The idea that everything the Sussexes did was being pulled into a single interpretive field where coincidence was no longer an acceptable explanation. This wasn't new, but it had intensified, and intensity changes perception. Inside Montecito, according to commentary from Royal Watch circles and unnamed sources close to the couple circulating in the media ecosystem, there was frustration, not just at criticism but at the speed of reinterpretation. The feeling that nothing could land cleanly anymore, that every attempt at reset was absorbed instantly into the larger storyline and repurposed. Even silence had stopped working. Because silence, too, had become readable. If they spoke, it was strategy. If they didn't, it was avoidance. If they responded, it was defensive. If they ignored it, it was confirmation. There was no neutral position left, and that is where the real tension of this phase emerged. Not in any single controversy, but in the loss of narrative escape routes. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the royal institution continued its own approach. Minimal response, maximum continuity. Engagements were carried out, appearances were scheduled. Photographs were released with a consistency that, to some observers, felt almost architectural in its stability. There was no engagement with the noise. No attempt to correct the commentary ecosystem, just forward motion. And in modern media dynamics, forward motion often reads as authority, even when it is not meant to. In contrast, the Sussex narrative, shaped by interviews, documentaries, books, and speeches, felt reactive by design. Each new chapter appeared to be responding to something that had already been said elsewhere. Even when it wasn't explicitly framed that way, the timing often created that impression. And perception, once formed, becomes its own kind of evidence. By the time the next major public appearance arrived, the conversation had already shifted again. This time, it wasn't about what was said on stage. It was about what people expected to hear before the microphone was even turned on. That expectation gap is where modern public figures begin to lose control. Because once the audience predicts the emotional architecture of your speech, they stop listening for content and start listening for confirmation. And confirmation is a very narrow window. Too emotional and it becomes performative. Too restrained and it becomes evasive. Too personal and it becomes strategic. Too general and it becomes empty. There is no winning configuration, only varying degrees of interpretation. Behind the scenes, at least according to commentary circulating in media analysis circles, the Sussex strategy continued to focus on brand independence, philanthropic identity, lifestyle positioning, and selective engagement with global causes. But the challenge was structural. They were attempting to build autonomy inside a story that still defined them relationally. Every new initiative was still filtered through the lens of their past. Every brand expansion still carried the weight of comparison. Every public moment still echoed against the institution they left. And so the paradox deepened. The further they tried to move away, the more visible the connection became. Not because of action, but because of attention. Attention behaves like gravity in public life. It does not require intention, it only requires mass, and the Sussex narrative still had mass. A separate thread of commentary focused on Harry specifically. His public presence, increasingly described in media analysis as supportive rather than central, became a recurring talking point. Not necessarily because of anything he said, but because of how he appeared alongside Meghan in shared appearances. Observers projected meaning onto posture, spacing, timing. A step behind became symbolism, a glance became commentary, a pause before speaking became interpretation. None of these readings were verifiable in a factual sense, but they accumulated anyway, building a composite image that existed independently of any single moment. This is how modern public figures become mythologized in real time, not through truth or falsehood, but through repetition, and repetition is persuasive even when it is unproven. At the same time, Meghan's public messaging continued to emphasize themes of stability, happiness, and personal clarity. She spoke, directly or indirectly depending on the format, about gratitude, about family life, about building something sustainable outside traditional systems of power. To supporters, this was evolution. To critics, it was repositioning. To the general public, it was increasingly just content, and content is consumed, not contextualized. The children, as always, remained at the center of emotional interpretation, without being physically present in the public frame. Mentioned occasionally in speeches, referenced in anecdotes, but absent from direct visibility. This absence created its own narrative vacuum. In modern media ecosystems, absence does not reduce attention, it amplifies speculation. And speculation fills gaps faster than official messaging can respond. Royal commentators often return to one central theme, the collision between two storytelling systems. On one side, a monarchy built on continuity, ritual, and controlled visibility. On the other, a modern media operation built on access, personalization, and narrative immediacy. Neither system is inherently superior, but they are structurally incompatible. One survives by limiting interpretation. The other survives by expanding it, and expansion, once started, is difficult to reverse. As the months progressed in this unfolding narrative arc, even neutral observers began to notice something unusual. The story was no longer being driven by events alone. It was being driven by expectation of events. What will they respond next? What does this mean for the brand? How will this be interpreted in the wider context? The questions became the content. And when questions become content, resolution becomes impossible, because resolution ends engagement. And engagement is the currency of modern visibility. Inside that cycle, every appearance becomes a referendum, every silence becomes a statement, every coincidence becomes a pattern, and every pattern becomes a story too coherent to ignore. Yet ironically, the coherence may be the illusion, because when everything connects, nothing is independently verified anymore. It is only relationally interpreted, and interpretation is infinite, which brings the narrative to its current state. Suspended, looping, unresolved, not collapsing, not stabilizing, but continuously reframing itself through every new public moment. And somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the commentary, beneath the analysis, beneath the competing interpretations, there remains a simpler reality that rarely survives the media cycle intact. Two people attempting to define a life in public while the public defines it back. Not as they are, but as the story requires them to be. And in that tension, the Sussex narrative continues, not as a fairy tale, not as a downfall, but as something more modern and more unstable, a story that only exists while it is being told, and cannot stop being told without disappearing entirely. The next chapter, inevitably, is already being written, not by the people in it, but by the reaction to them, and that is where the real power now sits. Chapter: The echo that doesn't fade. By the time the next wave arrived, it didn't arrive like news anymore. It arrived like déjà vu. A familiar headline shape, a familiar cycle of reaction, a familiar set of interpretations that appeared almost before the facts had fully landed. Inside the media ecosystem, they had started calling it the echo loop. Not officially, not in any newsroom memo, but in the quiet shorthand of commentators who had watched the same pattern, repeat often enough to recognize its outline. Something happens. It is reported, it is interpreted, it is reframed. And by the time the original moment is over, what remains is not the event itself, but the echo of how it was received. For Harry and Meghan, that echo had become louder than the original sound. The latest trigger was, on its surface, unremarkable, a routine appearance tied to a philanthropic initiative. No major announcement, no dramatic unveiling, no explicit statement designed to provoke reaction. And yet, within minutes of the footage circulating, the interpretation machine had already begun to spin. The tone of Meghan's remarks was described as measured by some, carefully composed by others, and strategically restrained by commentators who believed restraint itself had become a message. Harry, appearing beside her, was again placed into the familiar analytical frame, present, supportive, secondary, a role that required no dialogue to be defined. The irony, as one commentator noted, was that the less either of them said, the more was written about what they must have meant. This was the modern paradox of visibility. Silence no longer protected you, it only invited interpretation, and interpretation never arrives alone, it arrives with momentum. Within hours, the discussion had split into parallel realities. In one, the Sussexes were stabilizing, refining their public identity into something more mature, less reactive, more intentional. In another, they were recalibrating, responding to pressure, adjusting positioning, managing narrative fatigue. In yet another, they were simply continuing a cycle that had never truly changed at all. Same actors, different framing, endless revision. The truth, as always in such environments, was less important than the structure of belief forming around it. Because once a narrative structure becomes stable, it begins to absorb contradictory information without breaking. It simply reclassifies it. A calm statement becomes damage control. A warm appearance becomes image repair. A private milestone becomes strategic timing. Even absence becomes presence, because absence is interpreted as deliberate. Inside this interpretive environment, the Sussex narrative had reached a peculiar maturity. It no longer depended on action to sustain itself. It depended on attention. And attention, once trained, becomes self-perpetuating. A former media producer, quoted anonymously in a commentary segment, described it bluntly: "It's not that every move is calculated. It's that every move is now legible as calculation. That distinction is everything. Because once legibility becomes universal, intent becomes irrelevant." At the same time, across the Atlantic, the royal institution continued its own rhythm, structured, ceremonial, visually consistent. Engagements proceeded without commentary on the surrounding discourse. Images were released with careful pacing. Appearances were aligned with tradition rather than response. To supporters, this appeared as discipline. To critics, distance. To analysts, it was strategy by absence. Because in modern narrative conflict, even refusal to participate is interpreted as participation. The two systems, one reactive, one restrained, continued to orbit each other without direct contact, like opposing gravitational fields shaping the same space without ever touching. And in that invisible tension, the public imagination did the rest. It filled in gaps, it connected dots, it constructed meaning where none had been explicitly offered. Meanwhile, inside the Sussex orbit, the focus reportedly remained on continuity, projects in development, partnerships in negotiation, and a sustained effort to define identity outside inherited frameworks. But the challenge was no longer creation, it was containment. How do you build something new when everything new is immediately compared to what came before? How do you speak in your own voice when every sentence is still translated through an older language? And most importantly, how do you stop being a reference point in a story you are no longer trying to write? These questions do not have public answers. They only have public consequences. Harry's position in this evolving structure continued to draw particular attention, not because of any single moment, but because of accumulated perception. His public presence, often described in commentary as subdued or reflective, became a screen onto which meaning was projected. Some saw loyalty, others saw displacement, some saw adaptation, others saw erosion, but all agreed on one thing: he was no longer the central axis of his own narrative. He had become part of its frame, and frames by definition are not where the focus rests. They are what hold the focus in place. As for Meghan, her role in the narrative ecosystem had become even more complex. She was simultaneously positioned as architect, spokesperson, symbol, and subject, roles that overlap in theory but collide in practice. Every public statement was parsed for tone, every appearance for intent, every pause for implication, and every success for motive. In such an environment, neutrality is impossible. Everything becomes directional. Even joy is assigned purpose. Even calm is assigned strategy. Even routine is assigned meaning. The result is exhaustion, not necessarily personal exhaustion, but narrative exhaustion. A state in which the audience begins to tire not of the individuals, but of the constant requirement to interpret them. That fatigue is dangerous, because once interpretation fatigue sets in, engagement shifts, from interest to skepticism, from skepticism to dismissal, and dismissal is the one position from which narratives rarely recover. By the time the next cycle of commentary emerged, it was no longer focused on what had happened. It was focused on what it all meant in aggregate. Not a moment, a pattern, not a decision, a direction, not a couple, a construct. And constructs, once established, are difficult to dismantle because they do not live in reality alone. They live in repetition. Each retelling strengthens them. Each analysis reinforces them. Each debate stabilizes them further. And so the Sussex narrative continues, not because it is fixed, but because it is continuously reconstructed. In editorial rooms, in comment sections, in analysis videos, in late-night monologues, in conversations that begin with facts and end with interpretation. It is no longer a story owned by its subjects. It is a story owned by its retelling. And in that shift lies the most important transformation of all. The moment when a public life stops being lived and starts being narrated. The echo remains. And it is not fading.